The lantern light spilled from the farmhouse window in a long golden rectangle across the frost-bitten grass, and Petra Farrow stood in the middle of it holding a rifle she barely knew how to fire, pointing it at the shadow that had stepped out from behind her barn. 3 years. 3 years she had lived alone on this land, buried her husband in the corner of the property beside the elm tree he loved, fought off drought and debt and men who thought a widow was just an opportunity waiting to be exploited. 3 years she had survived every single night believing she was alone out here, and now this shadow was telling her differently. "How long?" she said. Her voice did not shake, which surprised her. The rifle barrel did shake, just barely, but her voice came out clear and cold as Winter Creek water. The man did not move toward her. He was tall, broader in the shoulder than she had expected from a shadow, and his hat brim was pulled low. His hands were raised, open, palms facing her in that universal gesture that meant he wanted her to understand he had no intention of reaching for the pistol she could see at his hip. "Madam, I need you to let me explain before you pull that trigger," he said. "How long?" she said again. Not a question this time. A demand. He let out a slow breath. She could see it cloud in the cold air between them. 3 years, he said. "Give or take a few nights." The rifle wavered. Her arms were trembling now, and she could not tell anymore if it was from cold or fury or something else entirely. Something that she refused to name while she was still pointing a weapon at another human being. 3 years. He had been out here every night for 3 years. He had watched her bury her husband. He had watched her cry on the porch steps that first summer when the crops failed and she thought she was finished. He had watched her every night when she walked to the well, when she locked the doors, when she turned the lantern down. "Why?" she said, and this time her voice did crack. He looked at her for a long moment across the lantern light and the frozen grass and the distance between them that felt like everything and nothing at all. "Because the first night I came to this farm," he said quietly, "I came to rob it. And then I saw you, and I never left." The rifle came down 2 inches, not because she trusted him, but because something about that sentence hit her square in the chest like a stone thrown into still water, and the ripples were going to take a long time to settle. She needed to understand. She needed to go back to the beginning of this story, because she was standing in the middle of something enormous, and she did not yet have the edges of it. The beginning of it was the spring of 1882. Petra Farrow had come west from Ohio with her husband, Thomas Farrow, who was 34 years old and full of ideas about new land and new starts. Thomas had been a good man in the way that quiet, earnest men are good, meaning that he worked hard and he did not drink, and he loved her with a steady and uncomplicated devotion that she had returned in kind. They had settled in the territory of New Mexico, 40 miles north of Las Cruces, on a property that had been advertised in an eastern paper as having rich bottomland and a reliable spring. The bottomland was real. The spring was less reliable than advertised. But they had come all this way and there was nothing to do but make it work. Thomas had built the farmhouse himself with lumber hauled from town and help from 2 neighboring ranchers who lived 5 and 8 miles away, respectively. He had fenced the pasture and dug a proper well and planted alfalfa and corn and kept 4 chickens and a milk cow named Abigail. Petra had made curtains from flour sacks and a garden from seed packets she had carried all the way from Ohio, wrapped in oilcloth. They had been, in the way that hard-working people can be, happy. Then in the summer of 1882, the summer after they arrived, Thomas Farrow had gone into Las Cruces on a Thursday to buy wire for a fence repair, and on the road home he had been thrown from his horse when the animal shied at a rattlesnake. He had hit his head on a rock. He had not come home that Thursday. The neighboring rancher, a man named Gerald Boone, had found Thomas the next morning and brought him back to Petra on a wagon, already gone. Petra Farrow was 26 years old when she became a widow. She had no children. She had no family within 1,000 miles. She had a farm, a cow, 4 chickens, a seed garden, a failing well, and about $40 in a tin box buried under the floorboards. She did not leave. That was the thing about Petra Farrow that people in town both admired and did not quite understand. She did not pack up her things and go back east. She went to the barn the morning after they buried Thomas, fed Abigail and the chickens, looked out at the fields, and decided that she was going to stay. The reasons were complicated, and she had never tried to fully explain them to anyone, partly because she was a private person by nature, and partly because the truest part of the reason was this. Thomas had worked himself to the bone for this land. He had believed in it. She could not leave it to become nothing. It would have felt like leaving him twice. She learned, that first terrible summer, to do everything alone. She learned to plow and plant and harvest and fix fences, and shoe a horse with moderate success, and patch a roof, and carry water from the well when it was running low, and haul it from the creek when it was not. She learned to fire the rifle Thomas had left, though she never got particularly good at it. She learned to keep accounts and negotiate with the grain broker in Las Cruces, who tried, the first 2 times, to cheat her. She learned to be harder than she naturally was. The nights were the worst. Not because she was afraid, exactly, or not only because of that. The nights were the worst because the silence of a New Mexico desert night is enormous and absolute. And when you are lying in the bed that used to hold 2 people, and now holds 1, that silence presses down on you like a physical weight. Eli Crane had not planned to be anywhere near the Farrow farm in the spring of 1882. He had not planned much of anything for most of his adult life, which was either a symptom of the life he had been living or a cause of it, and he had long since stopped trying to determine which. He was 30 years old when this story properly begins, which meant he had been 27 when he first came to the Farrow farm, and the 10 years before that had been spent in a series of increasingly poor decisions, beginning with falling in with a gang of cattle rustlers in Texas at the age of 17, and ending with where he was now, which was a man with a price on his head in 2 territories and no particular place in the world that could be called home. He was not cruel. That was the thing about Eli Crane that did not fit the category of outlaw as most people understood it. He had never in his life harmed another person directly. He had stolen cattle and horses and money and goods, and he had done it with a skill and a quietness that had made him valuable to the various outfits he had ridden with. But he had a line he would not cross, and the line was violence, and that line had eventually made him a liability to men who had no such lines. And so he had ended up, at 27, alone, and moving through New Mexico with no particular plan. The night he came to the Farrow farm, he had been riding for 2 days without food. He had about $12 to his name and a horse named Scout, who was developing a worrying soreness in his left foreleg. His plan, if you could call it that, was to find a farm or a ranch, take what he needed from whatever they had stored in their outbuildings, and be gone before morning. He had seen the light in the farmhouse window from half a mile away across the flat desert dark. He had come in quiet, the way he always came in quiet, leaving Scout hobbled behind a rise a 1/4 mile back and covering the rest of the distance on foot. He had gone to the barn first, because that was where the useful things were. Feed for Scout, maybe a spare horse if he was lucky. And then the farmhouse door had opened. He had pressed himself against the side of the barn and gone completely still. A woman had stepped out onto the porch. She was carrying a bucket in one hand and a lantern in the other. and she walked across the yard toward the well with the practiced ease of someone performing a routine she had done 100 times. She was wearing a dark dress, and her hair was not put up the way women usually kept it at that hour but loose around her shoulders, and she was singing to herself, something low and quiet that he could not quite catch the words of. He stood there in the shadows beside the barn and watched her draw water and carry it inside and close the door behind her. He had been in the act of robbing her. He was, by every reasonable definition of the term, a criminal. He should have taken what he needed from the barn and been gone. Instead, he stood there in the shadow of the barn wall for another 20 minutes, looking at the farmhouse, feeling something move in his chest that he did not have a name for. Then he got the feed he had come for, took nothing else, walked back to Scout, and rode away. He came back the next night. He told himself he did not know why. He tied Scout in the same hollow behind the rise and walked to the farm and sat behind the barn for an hour watching the lamp burn in the window. He did not see her again that night. He saw the lamp go out around 9 o'clock, and the farm went dark and quiet, and he sat there in the desert chill, feeling like the world's most confused and pathetic criminal. Then he walked back to Scout and rode away again. He came back the third night and the fourth, and by the fifth night he had started to understand that he was not going to stop coming. He did not examine the reason too carefully. He understood that it was a new kind of foolishness and possibly the most dangerous thing he had ever done. But he had always been better at moving toward things than away from them, and this was where he found himself pointing. The first time he understood that something was wrong on the farm, something that went beyond the loneliness he could see in the set of her shoulders and the exhaustion in the way she moved at the end of a long day, was in the third week of his watching. He had come in after dark as usual and was settled against the fence on the far side of the barn when he heard horses coming up the road. Not one horse, 2 or 3. Moving fast and then slowing when they came near the farm, he was on his feet before he had consciously decided to stand. 2 men came down from the road and stopped at the gate of the yard. They did not come inside it. One of them called out toward the house, and he called loudly enough that Ellie could hear it. "Mrs. Farrow, come on out, Mrs. Farrow. We got something to discuss with you." The farm went silent for a moment. Then the door opened, and Petra Farrow came out onto the porch with a lamp, and Ellie saw from her posture that she knew who these men were and that she did not like them. "It is late, Mr. Dolan," she said. Her voice carried clearly across the yard. "Whatever you have to say to me, you can say it in town at a reasonable hour." The man called Dolan laughed. He was a big man. Ellie could see that even from 60 yards away, thick through the body and sitting on his horse with the comfortable confidence of someone who had never been told no in a way that stuck. "We just want to talk about the water rights, Mrs. Farrow, about how you've been using the creek." "The creek access was settled by the county surveyor's office 6 months ago," she said. "It is not a matter under discussion." "Well," Dolan said, "we think maybe it ought to be." Ellie had moved along the fence line while they talked, keeping low and quiet, getting closer. He had one hand on the pistol at his hip, not drawing it, just keeping the option available, but Dolan and his companion did not come through the gate. They sat on their horses at the edge of the property for another 5 minutes, talking at Petra in a tone that was designed to make her feel uncertain and small, and then they rode away. Ellie watched her stand on the porch for a long time after they left. She was very still. Then she went inside and he heard the sound of the bolt being drawn across the door. He sat behind the barn until midnight. When everything had been quiet for 2 hours and he was satisfied that Dolan and his friend were not coming back, he walked back to Scout. He understood, riding away that night, that this had changed in nature. He was not just watching anymore. He was watching over. There is a difference, and he understood the difference clearly, and he understood also that it was going to complicate everything. The man named Dahlin was Warren Dahlin, and he owned the largest cattle operation in the county, about 3,000 acres east of the Faro farm. He had been trying, by various means both legal and not, to acquire the Faro property for 2 years by the time Eli had his first glimpse of him. The reasons were practical. The Faro bottomland was genuinely good soil, and more importantly, it contained the access point to the creek that fed both properties. If Dahlin controlled the water, he controlled the land for 20 miles in any direction during a dry year. Eli pieced this together over the following months from listening to conversations in Las Cruces, which he visited carefully and infrequently, always disguised with a full beard and a different hat, buying supplies and keeping his ears open. It was a mining town with a cattle overlay, which meant it was a place where men talked loudly about money and land in saloons, and Eli had always been a good listener. What he learned was that Dahlin had tried to buy the Faro farm twice and been refused. He had then attempted to dispute the water rights through the county records office and lost, partly because the survey was clear and partly because the county surveyor had principles, which was not always a given. He had also, according to a conversation Eli overheard between a ranch hand and a deputy, sent men to the property twice at night to damage fences and scare the livestock. The second time the fence damage had happened, it was the winter of the first year, and Eli had been there when it happened. He had watched 2 men come in from the east side of the property with wire cutters while Petra was asleep, and he had followed them as they worked, and when they were done and moving back toward the east fence line, he had stepped into their path in the dark. "I wouldn't come back," he had said. That was all. He had not drawn his weapon. He had not needed to. 2 men who are doing something they know is wrong, confronted by a quiet figure in the dark, tend to assume that the figure is more dangerous than it may actually be, and these 2 men had made that assumption and left quickly. He had then, in the remaining hours before dawn, repaired the fence. He had done it without thinking about whether it was sensible. He had done it because she would have woken up to a broken fence and scared animals and a cold fear in her chest, and the thought of that was intolerable to him in a way that he could not rationalize. By the end of the first year, this was the pattern. He came every night. He sat behind the barn or along the fence line or in the shadow of the cottonwood near the well. He watched the farm. He watched her. He made sure that nothing came near that property after dark that did not belong there. And when morning came and the sky began to pale in the east, he walked back to scout in the hollow and rode away. He had found a place to sleep during the day in a shallow cave 3 miles to the northwest, sheltered from the sun and invisible from the road. He kept his supplies there, and his horse, and a bedroll and 3 books he had acquired over the years, and carried everywhere, because he had discovered in his early 20s that books were one of the things that made him feel like a person, rather than just a body moving through the world. He did odd work sometimes, when the money ran low, for ranches or farms far enough away from the Faro property that no one would connect him to it. He was good with horses and could fix a fence faster than most men, and there was always work available for someone who showed up and worked hard and did not ask to be paid until the job was done. He used false names and moved carefully, and he had not in 3 years been arrested or even seriously questioned. He understood perfectly well, in love with a woman who did not know he existed. He was not an unintelligent man. He had no illusions about what this was. He had been sitting outside her farm every night for a year and a half, by the time he put the word to it plainly. Sitting behind her barn in the summer dark, with the sound of the crickets and the distant coyotes and the soft moving of the horses in the barn. And the word love had come to him with a clarity that felt more like recognition than discovery. He had known it longer than he had admitted it. He had also thought clearly, on many nights during that first year and into the second, about what he was. An outlaw, a wanted man, a person who had built his adult life on the wrong side of the line that divided people into the kind who deserved a woman like Petra Farrow, and the kind who did not. He thought about this often and with considerable honesty, which was the only kind of honesty he had ever had. And still he came back every night. The second year brought new problems. The spring of 1883 was dry, the driest in a decade according to the old-timers in Las Cruces, and the creek that fed both the Farrow farm and the Dahlin operation dropped to a trickle. This made the water rights not just a legal inconvenience for Dahlin but a genuine crisis, because without that creek access through the Farrow property, his cattle were going to suffer through the summer. Dahlin's response to crisis was pressure. He hired a man in the spring of 1883 named Gareth Foss, who was exactly the kind of man Ali had spent his career being careful not to become. A man for whom violence was not a last resort, but something close to a preference. Foss had a reputation in two territories, and it was not a good one. Ali learned about Foss's arrival in the county from the conversations in Las Cruces saloons, and he came back to the farm that night with a new kind of alertness. He changed his position, moved away from the barn and out further into the perimeter, ranging the edges of the property in a wider circle through the night. He stayed later into the morning until the sun was fully up, and there was no question of a night-time approach. Foss came in July. He came alone in the middle of a moonless night from the east side of the property where the fence had been cut before. He was good, Ali admitted that. He moved quietly and he was patient, but he had not accounted for anyone else being out there, and Ali had the advantage of knowing the ground. He let Foss get inside the fence line before he stepped out of the dark behind him. "Stop right there," he said, quietly. "The way you say something when you do not need to raise your voice to be believed." Foss stopped. He was a lean man in dark clothes, and his hand went immediately toward his hip. "Don't," Ali said. "Whatever you're being paid, it is not enough for tonight. Turn around and go back the way you came." The silence between them was long and specific. Foss was calculating, and Ali knew what he was calculating. He was trying to determine whether the voice in the dark behind him belonged to someone with the capability and the willingness to back it up. "Who are you?" Foss said. "The kind of person who makes your night much worse if you don't leave," Ali said. Foss left. He went back over the fence and into the dark and did not come back that night or for several nights following. Ali knew he had not scared him off permanently. He had only bought time. This was the pattern of the second year. Foss probed. Ali held the perimeter. Petra Farrow slept and worked and struggled and survived without knowing any of it was happening, and the situation remained a sustained tension, like a wire stretched too tight, threatening to snap without warning. He had, by the middle of the second year, become deeply acquainted with the details of her life in the way that you can only become acquainted with someone through sustained and silent attention. He knew when she slept and when she did not. He knew that on the nights when the loneliness was very bad, she would sit on the porch for an hour after dark with a cup of something hot and look at the sky in a way that he recognized. The looking of a person cataloging their own interior rather than the exterior world. He knew that she sang when she worked, and that her singing was beautiful, a clear and unself-conscious soprano that she apparently had no idea was remarkable. He knew that she talked to the cow Abigail in full sentences while she milked, including updates on the state of the crops and commentary on the behavior of the grain broker in town. and that Abigail appeared to find this perfectly acceptable. He knew that she had 3 dresses she rotated for daily work, and one that she wore only on Sundays to the church that was 12 miles away in Las Cruces, and that this Sunday dress was the color of deep water, and that she wore it with a kind of dignity that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with self-respect. He knew that she had her husband's photograph on the mantelpiece inside, because on warm nights she left the front window open, and he had seen it once when he passed at the right angle. He knew that she still visited the elm tree in the corner of the property on Sunday evenings when she came home from town. He knew that she was the loneliest person he had ever watched, and also the most self-contained, and that these 2 things were not contradictory. He had, by this point, stopped trying to talk himself out of what he felt. He had simply accepted it and continued to live with it and do what he did every night, which was keep her safe in the dark hours she did not know needed keeping. The turn came in the 3rd year. In the fall of 1884, Eli was in Las Cruces buying supplies when he heard, in the general store, a conversation that stopped him cold. A man whose name he did not know, speaking to the store owner, said that he had heard Warren Dahlin was moving on the Faro property again. That Dahlin had found a lawyer from El Paso who was arguing that the water rights survey had been improperly conducted, and that a new survey would overturn the existing ruling. And that Dahlin, who was the kind of man who liked to secure outcomes before the official process confirmed them, had also been heard to say that it would be simpler for everyone if the widow who was causing all this trouble would just take whatever he offered her and leave. Eli stood in the general store holding a tin of coffee beans and a sack of dried corn and listened to this, and felt the wire inside him tighten to a pitch that was almost painful. He bought his supplies and left and did not go to his cave that day. Instead, he rode 10 miles north to a property he had worked briefly under a false name, where a man named Cornelius Webb ran a small cattle operation with more honesty and decency than most. Webb had once told him, in the casual way that decent men say significant things, that if he ever needed the name of a straight lawyer in Las Cruces, he knew one. Eli went to Webb and asked for the name. He then rode to Las Cruces, and after 2 days of careful and indirect observation, approached the lawyer, a man named Albert Marsh who kept an office above the hardware store on Main Street. He did not give his name. He explained the situation regarding the Faro property and the water rights and Dahlin's new lawyer, and he paid Marsh $50 in cash, which was almost everything he had, to review the original survey and prepare a counter-argument. He had no way of ensuring that Marsh would then bring this to Petra Faro's attention. He trusted that a lawyer who had been paid to prepare a defense would want to use it. He also composed, with considerable care, an anonymous letter that he left at the post office addressed to Mrs. P. Faro, informing her that there was a lawyer in Las Cruces named Albert Marsh who had information relevant to a legal challenge she might be about to face. He did not sign it. He printed it in block letters so it could not be traced to a particular hand. He felt, riding back to the cave that night, a peculiar mixture of satisfaction and desolation. He had done something useful. He had done it from a distance. He was still exactly nowhere in relation to her. Marsh turned out to be, in fact, a good lawyer. Eli learned from subsequent overheard conversations that he had met with Petra Faro in October, and that he had been prepared, and that, when Dahlin's El Paso lawyer arrived in November with his challenge, Marsh had met him with a counter-argument so thorough that the challenge collapsed in the county records office before it got to the judge. Dahlin had lost. Again. Ellie sat behind the barn the night after word of this reached him and felt something that was as close to happiness as he could get from where he was standing, which was 60 yards away in the dark from a woman who still had no idea he existed. It was in December of 1884 that Foss came back. He did not come alone this time. He came with 2 other men, and he came in the hour after midnight, and he came through the north fence instead of the east, which was where Ellie had been expecting him. Ellie was already ranging the perimeter when he heard the horses coming in from the north, and he moved fast, cutting across the east pasture in a diagonal run, reaching the north fence line just as the 3 men came through a section they had cut. He could see from their body language and the way they were moving that this was not a scouting operation. This was something with a purpose and a plan. He stepped into the open between them and the farmhouse. "That's far enough," he said, 3 against 1. He knew the math. He also knew Foss by this point, well enough to know how Foss would think. Foss would look at a single figure in the dark and make the same calculation he always made, which was whether the risk of confronting that figure was worth the reward of the job. What changed the calculation was what happened next. Ellie kept his hands visible and his voice level, and he said, "I know what Dahlan is paying you, Foss, and I know what he's paying you is not worth the conversation that happens next if you take another step toward that house." "There's 3 of us," Foss said. "I can count," Ellie said. "But here's what you should think about. You know my face now, and if anything happens to that farm or the woman in it at any point ever, you are going to find yourself with a problem you can't see coming. That's not a threat. That's a fact. I am the most patient man you have ever had the misfortune to meet." The silence was very long. Ellie could hear the horses shifting in the barn behind him, disturbed by the tension in the air. The moon was a thin crescent and the starlight was enough to see faces but not expressions. Then Foss said something to the men with him that Ellie could not quite hear, and all 3 of them turned and walked back through the fence. Ellie stood there until the sound of horses moving away was fully gone. Then he went to the cut section of fence and repaired it in the dark using wire he had started carrying in a roll on his belt, because this was no longer an unusual situation. He did not sleep that day. He stayed close to the farm, resting in the hollow behind the rise with Scout, but watching the road. When nothing came and the day passed quietly, he came back that night and took up his position and sat in the dark and thought about how long this could go on. The answer, he was beginning to admit to himself, was that it could not go on indefinitely. Foss would come back with better odds or a better plan, or Dahlan would find some other approach, and the situation required more than a single man in the dark who nobody knew was there. He sat with this for a week. He sat with it and turned it from every angle and arrived each time at the same place, which was the place he had been avoiding for 3 years. He was going to have to talk to her. He was going to have to walk up to her door and knock on it and be seen. He was going to have to be a person who existed in her world rather than a shadow at its edge. And everything that involved was terrifying to him in a way that a man in a dark field alone against 3 armed men was not, because this required something different from him entirely. This required him to be honest. He spent 3 more days working up to it. He watched her from his usual position and thought about what to say and discarded everything he thought of as inadequate. He thought about starting from the beginning, which seemed both necessary and impossible. He thought about starting with the immediate danger, which was true but felt like a manipulation. He thought about lying about how long he had been there, which he decided immediately he would not do. He was going to tell her the truth, all of it. Whatever she did with it was going to be her right. On a Thursday night in late January of 1885, he walked across the frost-bitten grass to the circle of lantern light at the front of the farmhouse. He knocked on the door. She did not open it immediately. He heard movement inside and then quiet, and he understood she was listening and possibly reaching for the rifle. "Mrs. Farrow," he said, "I'm not here to harm you. I need to speak with you. I know this is unusual and I know it's late and I'm asking you to hear me out." The door opened 2 inches. He could see one eye and the side of her face and the end of the rifle barrel. "What do you want?" she said. "To tell you something important about this farm," he said. "About danger you may be about to face that you need to know about." The door opened wider, not all the way, but enough. She was looking at him directly, and her eyes were sharp and assessing, and he understood immediately that this was not a woman who frightened easily or who was going to accept a vague warning and close the door. "You have 2 minutes," she said, "and I am holding this rifle the entire time." "That's fair," he said. He told her about Dahlan and Foss, and the night attack he had turned back 3 days before. He told her in plain language with specific details, because he could see that she responded to specificity the way intelligent people do, with belief that comes not from trust, but from the recognition of genuine knowledge. He told her she needed to let the sheriff in Las Cruces know what Foss had done, and that she had a witness available if needed. She listened without interrupting. When he was done, she said, "How do you know all of this?" And that was the question. That was the moment where he could have given a partial answer, some version of the truth that left out the part that was going to be hardest to hear. He thought about it for exactly 1 second. "I need to tell you something else," he said. "And I need you to stay with the rifle raised while I tell it if that makes you feel safer, because I understand that what I'm about to say is going to be difficult to hear." She raised the rifle slightly. Her jaw was set. He told her. He told her about the first night 3 years ago. About coming to rob the farm and stopping. About coming back the next night and the one after. About the fence repairs and Foss and the anonymous letter to the lawyer and every night in between. He told it plainly and without trying to make it sound better than it was. He watched her face while he told it, and her expression moved through things he could not fully read, complex things that seemed to involve several emotions at once. When he was done, the yard was very quiet. The frost on the grass caught the lantern light in a way that made the ground look like it was made of small, scattered diamonds. "How long?" she said. 3 years, he said. "Give or take a few nights." She stood there for what felt like a very long time. The rifle was still raised. Then it came down 2 inches, which was not far, but it was something. "What is your name?" she said. "Ellie Crane," he said. She repeated it to herself quietly, as if she were taking its measure. Then she looked at him directly and said, "I'm going to need you to come back tomorrow, in the daylight, and I'm going to need you to explain all of it again, because I have questions and I am not capable of asking them properly tonight." "All right," he said. "And if anything you told me turns out to be a lie," she said, "I will shoot you. And I am a better shot than I was 3 years ago." "I believe you," he said. She went inside and he heard the bolt go across the door, and he stood in the yard for a moment, in the lantern light that was now fading through the window as she turned it down, and he felt something move through him that was the specific and peculiar sensation of a man who has been carrying something alone for a very long time and has just, for the first time, set it down. He came back at 9 in the morning. She opened the door before he knocked, which told him she had been watching the road. She was in her work dress with her hair pinned back, and she had a pot of coffee on the stove and 2 cups on the table, and he understood from this that she had made a decision in the night, not about him specifically, but about the conversation. She had decided to have it properly. He sat across from her at the kitchen table and answered questions for 2 hours. She asked about who he was and where he had come from. He told her about Texas and the cattle outfit and the 10 years that followed, without making excuses, and without asking for sympathy, because he had not been a good man in the legal sense of the term, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. He told her about the crimes he had committed, which were numerous if not violent, and he told her about the warrants on his head in 2 territories, which meant he could not walk into a sheriff's office as a witness without risking his own arrest. She listened to all of this with a directness that was slightly unnerving. She did not flinch from the parts that were bad. She asked specific and intelligent follow-up questions that suggested she was building a complete picture rather than looking for a particular answer. She asked about the letter to the lawyer. He told her. She already knew then that it had come from outside because Marsh had told her someone had paid his retainer anonymously. She had wondered about that for months. She asked about the fence repairs. He told her about each one, including the detail that he had been carrying wire on his belt for the past year. She was quiet for a moment after that. Then she said, "Why?" It was a simple question, and it was the most complicated question she could have asked, and they both knew it. "Because you were alone and you should not have been," he said. He said it plainly, without embellishment, because embellishment would have cheapened it. "Because from the first night I saw this farm, it seemed wrong to me that no one was keeping watch over it. And because I didn't know what else to do with what I felt after that first night except come back and try to make myself useful." She looked at him for a long time. Her coffee cup was in both her hands, and she was looking at him over the rim of it, and her eyes were the color of river water in the shade, a deep blue-gray that he had not been able to see clearly from 60 yards in the dark. "That is the strangest thing I have ever heard," she said. "And I have heard some very strange things in the past 3 years." "I know," he said. "I don't know what to do with you," she said. "I'm not asking you to do anything with me," he said. "I told you the truth because you deserve to know it, and because the situation with Dalan and Foss is real, and you need to be able to handle it with all the information. What happens next is entirely up to you." She set the coffee cup down. She looked at the table and then at him. "What would happen if I went to the sheriff about Foss?" she said. "Depends on the sheriff," Illy said. "The current one has more integrity than most. If you go with specific details about what Foss did to your fence and that you have a witness to the night assault, he would at least bring Foss in for questioning. Dalan has influence, but he's lost 2 legal fights already. A third incident with documented evidence would start to make the county very uncomfortable with him. And you could be my witness," she said. "If I testified," he said carefully, "my name would go on a document. And my name on a document would likely lead to my arrest before the case got to trial. So you can't actually help me that way," she said. "No," he said. "Not in the official way. I can tell you everything I know and you can decide what to do with it. You can describe to the sheriff what happened without specifying the source. The fence damage is physical evidence. The cut section is there. That's enough to start with." She was quiet again. He waited. He was good at waiting. "I would like you to come back tomorrow," she said finally. "I need time to think." He came back the next day, and the day after that. Each time she had more questions, and each time he answered them, and she was building something in those conversations. He could feel it, some kind of internal structure that she needed to have solid before she could move forward. He did not rush her, and he did not push. He sat at her kitchen table and drank her coffee and answered what she asked and nothing more. On the 4th day, she asked him a question he had not expected. "You want to stay?" she said. He was very still. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she said carefully, "that I need someone who knows this land and this situation, and that there is a falling down outbuilding on the east side of the property that used to be a bunkhouse. And I mean that you have been sleeping in a cave, which is," she paused, not something a person should be doing in January. "You're offering me work," he said. "I am offering you a roof and something that resembles a job," she said, "which is not the same as offering you anything else, and which comes with the understanding that I make the decisions on this farm, and I do not require anyone to do anything except what I ask them to do." "That sounds reasonable," he said. "And," she said, "it also comes with the understanding that your past is your own business, and that I have thought about it enough to believe that a man who spent 3 years fixing my fences in the dark is not primarily a danger to me." He moved into the bunkhouse on a Saturday. It was small and cold, and the roof had a problem in one corner that he fixed within the first 2 days. He got his supplies from the cave and brought Scout to the barn, and Abigail regarded the new horse with measured suspicion that gradually resolved into tolerance. The first weeks were formal. He worked hard, because he was good at work, and because working was the clearest language he had in this new situation. He fixed everything that was broken on the property, which was substantial, and he did it methodically, and without being asked, because he had spent 3 years cataloging the farm's needs from 60 yards away, and now he could finally address them directly. The fence on the north side, which Foss had cut, he rebuilt from scratch. The well, which had been inconsistent since the first summer, he dug out and relined with stone until it ran clear and reliable. The barn roof, which had a growing sag on the east side, he reinforced with new timber. He built a proper chicken coop to replace the makeshift one that had been letting cold air in. Petra watched all of this with an expression that was hard to read. She was not cold to him, but she was careful. She had a way of being in the same space as a person without giving much away, a quality he recognized because he had the same quality. And the two of them moved around each other in those first weeks like people learning the dimensions of a new room. She paid him for his work. That was something he had not expected, not because he had not expected fairness, but because the farm's finances were obviously tight, and the addition of a wage was a genuine sacrifice. When he tried to refuse it, she looked at him with an expression that said she was not going to negotiate, and he accepted the money. She went to the sheriff in February. She took Ellie's information, arranged in the form of a clear statement about fence damage and a night intrusion by identified individuals, and she laid it in front of the sheriff in Las Cruces with the calm certainty of someone who knows they are right. Ellie waited outside on the street, watching the window of the sheriff's office, ready to ride if the conversation went badly. It did not. The sheriff, a man named Darnell Hayes who had been in the job long enough to have seen Dahlen operate before and to have his own opinions about it, listened carefully and took notes and sent 2 deputies to find Gareth Foss. Foss, when found, declined to be held in place by the process and left the county. Ellie learned this from the bunkhouse, where Petra came to tell him, and her expression was something close to relief, though she kept it contained in the way she kept most things. Dahlen did not come again directly, not that winter. He was pulling back, recalculating. The legal loss and the Foss situation and the growing county awareness of his methods had cost him more than he had anticipated. He was not gone from the picture, but he was quiet, and quiet was manageable. Spring came. The change in the two of them happened in the way that slow things happen, incrementally and then all at once, so that later it was impossible to identify the exact moment, but the direction of it had been visible for a long time before either of them named it. He was aware of her in a way that was different from the watching from 60 yards awareness. Proximity changed things. She was not just a figure in lamplight anymore. She was a person who argued with the grain broker in town, with the precision of someone who had done the arithmetic, before she left the house, and was not going to let anyone tell her she was wrong. She was a person who laughed, which he had not heard clearly from 60 yards away, a real laugh that was quick and surprised and slightly at odds with her general air of self-containment. She was a person who read extensively, with a small collection of books that lived on a shelf above the fireplace and were clearly reread until their spines were soft, and who was apparently not interested in keeping her opinions about them private. She was reading one afternoon when she said, without looking up, "Have you ever read Middlemarch?" "No," he said. He was at the table mending a piece of tack. "You should," she said. "It is about people who make enormous sacrifices for things they believe in and whether that makes them foolish or admirable." He was quiet for a moment. "Which side does the book come down on?" he said. "Both," she said, "depending on which character you are." She looked up then, and they looked at each other for a moment longer than was strictly necessary for the conversation, and then she looked back down at her book. These were the things that accumulated. A book left on the bunkhouse windowsill one morning that was not his. Coffee that appeared on the outside step in a tin cup on mornings, when he was already at work in the barn before she had started her day. A conversation about Thomas Farrow on a spring evening on the porch, the first time she had spoken about him to Ellie directly. That lasted 3 hours and covered the arc of a marriage between two people who had loved each other honestly and simply, and which she told him as though it was something she needed to have witnessed by someone who understood the value of it. He listened to all of it and asked careful questions, and she talked about Thomas with a grief that had aged into something quieter and more durable than fresh loss, the kind of grief that had become part of the structure of a person rather than an emergency in them. "Do you miss the company most?" he asked once, "or do you miss him specifically?" It was a question that another person might have found offensive. She considered it honestly. "At first," she said, "I missed the company most. That felt shameful for a long time. Later I understood it was both and they were different kinds of missing. I miss him specifically still. He was a good man. But what I missed most in the first year was having someone who knew the whole of me, who held all the pieces of my life in their awareness along with their own." Ellie looked out at the yard in the failing light. "I think," he said carefully, "that most people experience their whole life from inside it and have no one who sees the outside of it with them." She looked at him. "That's a very lonely way to think about things." "It's accurate, though," he said. "Maybe," she said, "unless someone is paying attention." Neither of them said anything after that for a while. The evening sat around them with all its spring warmth and the sound of the frogs starting up from the direction of the creek. The summer of 1885 was when things shifted properly. In June, Dahlin tried a new approach. He filed a civil lawsuit claiming that a section of the Farrow property's north boundary fence encroached on land he claimed to own, an argument that would have required a new survey and could have tied up the property's legal status for months or years. It was a delaying tactic, and it was designed to make the farm financially unviable by creating uncertainty that would affect Petra's ability to get credit or sell crops. Ellie learned about the lawsuit 2 days before Petra did, from a man in Las Cruces. He came back and told her immediately, directly, without trying to soften it. She sat with the information for one evening, and then the next morning she rode to Las Cruces, hired Albert Marsh again, and began the process of countering the claim. But it was expensive. The legal fees were real and the farm was not flush, and by August, Petra was working through the numbers at the kitchen table with an expression that Ellie recognized as someone trying to find a solution that isn't there yet. "I can contribute," he said. She looked up. "With what?" "I have been saving since I got here," he said. "I have work wages and some other funds. Not everything that's needed, but enough to carry the legal fees through the fall." "I won't take money from you," she said. and her tone was the one he had come to know as absolute. "It's not taking," he said. "It's partnership. The farm is viable and Marsh will win this case the same way he won the last one. It just needs to get to the other side of the winter." "Partnership," she said. She was looking at him with an expression he could not fully read. "That's what it is," he said. "If you're willing." The word hung in the kitchen air between them. Partnership. It was a large word. It had edges that extended beyond legal fees and farm viability, and they both knew that, and neither of them was going to say it directly yet. "I'll think about it," she said. She thought about it for 2 days, and then she said yes. Marsh won the boundary case in October. Dahlon's surveyor turned out to have made errors in his own documentation that Marsh found and exploited with the thoroughness of a man who found legal detail genuinely enjoyable. The judge dismissed the claim with something in his ruling that was close to irritation directed at the plaintiff, and Dahlon was ordered to pay the court costs. It was the 3rd time Dahlon had lost. And there was a county commissioner's election coming in the spring, and the commissioner who was most closely associated with Dahlon was facing a challenger who had been notably interested in water rights as a campaign issue. And the political weather was changing in ways that made Dahlon's position less comfortable than it had been. He brought the news home from Las Cruces on a Thursday in October, in the late afternoon, and Petra was coming in from the fields when he rode through the gate, and the expression on his face told her before the words did. She stopped in the middle of the yard. She put one hand over her mouth for a moment and closed her eyes and took a long breath. "It's done," she said. "Dismissed," he said. "Completely." She let out the breath, and when she opened her eyes they were bright with something that was partly relief and partly something else. The specific kind of feeling you have when a fight you have been in for years is finally over and you are still standing. She crossed the yard to where he had dismounted from Scout, and she took his hand in both of hers and held it. She had never touched him before, not deliberately. She held his hand for a long moment, looking up at him. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it, for everything." "It was your fight," he said. "I just helped you hold the line." "That is not a small thing," she said. She let go of his hand and went inside, and he stood in the yard with Scout for a moment, feeling the specific residue of her hands in his. He had known for a long time what he felt. He had also known, with equal clarity, that he was not the kind of person who declared things without permission. She would have to come to this on her own terms and in her own time, and he was not going to push. But October was a warm month that year, the last warm stretch before the winter closed in, and they had both been through a lot together by then. And some things have their own timing that operates independently of what people plan. It happened on a Saturday evening in mid-October. They had eaten dinner together, which had become a regular thing by that point, not every night but most of them, and they were on the porch in the last of the warm dusk. She had the middle mark on her knee, but she was not reading it. She was looking at the cottonwood tree by the well and the way the last light caught its leaves. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes," he said. "When you came to this farm the first night," she said, "and you stopped. You said it was because you saw me. What did you see?" He was quiet for a moment. This deserved an honest answer, not a comfortable one. "I saw someone who was entirely alone," he said. "And I saw that the aloneness was not weakness. That was the thing. You were going about your life in the middle of the dark, and the silence like it was just the conditions, and you were getting on with things. And I thought," he paused, "I thought that I had never in my life seen anyone more worth keeping safe." She was very still. "That's what you thought." "That's what I thought," he said. She turned to look at him. The dusk light was doing something specific to her face, and he was aware. as he had been aware from a distance for 3 years and up close for the better part of a year, that she was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with being arranged for beauty. She was just that way, entirely herself. "Illy," she said. "Yes," he said. "I need to tell you something," she said, "because I have been thinking about it for a long time, and I think if I wait any longer I will talk myself out of it." "All right," he said. "I do not know," she said carefully, "what to make of the beginning of this. Of the 3 years. I have thought about it a great deal, and there are parts of it that I still find strange, and part of me knows that a reasonable person might see it differently than I do. But I also know what I know about people. And what I know about you is that you came to this farm to take something and you gave things instead, every single time." He was listening very carefully. "And I know that I have been," she said, then stopped and started again. "I know that I am not the same person I was 4 years ago. I was a married woman who loved her husband, and then I was a widow who was trying to survive, and then I was something else, someone harder and more alone, and then you came to my door and said my name and everything started to change again." She looked down at the book in her hands. "I think the reason I didn't ask you to leave," she said quietly, "after the first night after I heard everything is because some part of me recognized something. I didn't know what it was then. I think I know what it is now." "What is it?" he said. His voice was very quiet. She looked at him directly. "I think it is the feeling of someone seeing you," she said. "All of you. Not the version you show in town or the version you use to get through hard days, but the actual version. The one that sings to the cow and cries on the porch steps in summer and still visits the elm tree on Sundays." She paused. "You saw all of that." "I did," he said. "And you stayed," she said. "I stayed," he said. She reached out and took his hand again, and this time she did not let go. "I do not know what comes next," she said. "With the warrants and the past and all of it, I do not know how that gets resolved, but I know that I would like to find out if it can be, and I know that I would like you to be here while we figure it out. There is nowhere else I want to be," he said. "There hasn't been for 3 years." She leaned toward him slightly, the way a person does when they have decided something, and he met her there. And the first time he kissed her it was in the October dusk on the porch of the farm he had been guarding in the dark, and it was the most consequential thing he had done in 33 years of living. She was 30 years old, and she was the most real person he had ever been near. He held her face in his hands as carefully as if she were made of something breakable, which she absolutely was not, and she kissed him back with the directness she brought to everything, entirely present and entirely herself. The winter that followed was the quietest and the best winter he had ever lived. He was not given to extravagance in his interior life, but he was honest about it, and the honesty of that winter was this. He had spent his adult life in motion, always moving towards something or away from something, and the winter of 1885 was the first time in his memory that he was entirely still and entirely willing to be still. He worked on the farm. He helped her with the accounts, which he had a talent for that surprised her initially, and then did not once she considered that a man who had operated outside the law for 10 years without being caught had clearly developed practical intelligence. He helped her negotiate a better rate with the grain broker, which involved several conversations in Las Cruces that the broker experienced as something close to an education. He fixed the last remaining structural problem on the bunkhouse roof, and then moved, with her invitation and the implicit acknowledgement of what that meant, into the farmhouse. She gave him Thomas Farrow's side of the dresser, which he understood was significant and which he treated with care. He kept his things neatly, which she noted and appreciated. He built a new shelf above the fireplace for the books, which were now a combined collection, and the middle mark took its place next to a dog-eared copy of Moby Dick that had traveled with him for 6 years. They were careful with each other in the way that people who have both been through things tend to be careful. There was no rush. They had all winter and the prospect of spring and the farm to run, and they settled into each other the way two people do when they are genuinely compatible, not by collapsing into each other, but by adding to each other, by becoming more themselves in the company of the other than they had been alone. She told him more about her life in Ohio, about her parents who were both gone, about a sister in Columbus, whom she wrote to twice a year. He told her more about about a childhood in Texas that had been poor without being unhappy, about a mother who had died when he was 12 and a father who had done his best for some years afterward, before drink took him down a road that Ellie had declined to follow. He talked about the years of moving and stealing and the particular loneliness of a life without a fixed point, and she listened with the same attention she brought to everything, taking it in without flinching. She asked him once, in February, if he regretted the life he had led. "Not the whole of it," he said. "I regret specific choices that caused specific harms, the farms I took from, the men I defrauded, those things I regret. But not the sum total of it, because the sum total of it is what made me what I am and what I am ended up here." "That's a very pragmatic way to think about sin," she said. "I'm a pragmatic person," he said. "You are not entirely," she said. "A pragmatic person would not have spent 3 years sitting behind a barn in the dark." He conceded this point. The question of the warrants was real, and they both knew it. New Mexico had been a territory for a long time and had its own culture around men with checkered histories, the kind of culture that developed in places where the law was young and practical necessity often outweighed documentation. But the warrants existed, and they would continue to exist unless something was done about them. In the spring of 1886, Ellie rode to El Paso. He went alone, which Petra did not love, but she understood. He went to find a lawyer of a specific kind, the kind who dealt with the question of men who had been living outside the law and wanted to come in from that cold. This was not an impossible thing in 1886 in the Southwest. There were precedents. There were men who had done worse and found ways through. He was gone for 2 weeks, and she kept herself busy with the spring planting, and the accounts, and 2 long letters to her sister in Columbus that covered more personal ground than her letters usually did. He came back on a Thursday with a proposal from a lawyer named Henry Gable in El Paso, who had handled similar situations before. The process was not simple. It involved making a formal statement of known crimes, paying significant fines in lieu of prosecution for the property crimes, and a period of supervised residence in the territory, meaning he would need to present himself to a county official once a month for 2 years. The Texas warrant was the more serious one and required a separate negotiation, which Gable was beginning. The New Mexico warrant was resolvable within 6 months. "Can we afford it?" Petra said. She meant the fines. "Between the 2 of us," he said. "Yes," she nodded. "Then we do it." The process of making Ellie Crane a legal resident of New Mexico territory took 7 months, from the first conversation with Gable through the final document that was filed in the Las Cruces County Records Office in November of 1886. The Texas warrant took a full year after that, resolved through Gable's negotiations with the assistance of the New Mexico process as evidence of good faith, with fines paid, and a formal record of restitution made where the crimes were traceable. It was slow, and it cost them money they had worked hard to save, and it required Ellie to walk into a county office once a month for 2 years and present himself as a man under supervision, which was humiliating in the specific way that necessary humility is, but it was done. By the end of 1887, Ellie Crane's record was, if not clean, then resolved. He was a man who had settled his accounts with the law to the degree that the law allowed for, and the warrants were discharged. They were married in the spring of 1887, before the Texas process was fully resolved, because Petra said she was not going to wait for legal paperwork to do what she had already decided, and Ali was not in a position to argue with that. The wedding was small. The minister from the Las Cruces church came out to the farm because Petra did not want to make a public event of it, or not primarily because of that. She wanted to be married on her own land. She wanted the elm tree in the corner of the property to be visible from where they stood, which it was. She wore the blue water dress that Ali had never seen up close before, and had only ever seen from 60 yards away in the dark. And up close, it was the color of the sky at the horizon on a clear day, and she was in it with a simplicity and a lack of performance that made it the most beautiful thing he had seen in his life. Gerald Boone, the neighboring rancher who had brought Thomas Farrow home, came and stood as a witness. He did not ask many questions about Ali's history, and Ali appreciated this. Boone was a practical man. The minister read the words that ministers read, and Ali and Petra said the words that people say when they are making the largest promise available to them. And when it was over, they were standing in the spring sun of the yard in which he had spent 3 years as a shadow, and she had spent 3 years not knowing he was there. And she was his wife, and he was her husband, and the elm tree in the corner held all the history of the place in its quiet way. Warren Dahlin sold his cattle operation in the spring of 1887 and left the county. The circumstances were not something Illy had directly caused, though he had certainly not been unhelpful in making Dahlin's legal situation uncomfortable. The county commissioner who had been associated with Dahlin lost the election, and the new commissioner had opinions about how water rights ought to work that were materially different. Dahlin's business, which had relied partly on certain informal arrangements with the previous commissioner, became less profitable, and Dahlin was the kind of man who moved on when the returns stopped justifying the effort. He sold to a ranching company out of Denver and was gone by summer. The Farrow farm, which Illy was technically farming now alongside Petra, and which he had never asked her to rename but which she had added his name to the deed of, because she said it was his farm as much as it was hers, prospered in the way that farms prosper, when they are worked by two capable people who are paying attention. They expanded the alfalfa acreage and got a better price from a new broker in El Paso that Illy had located. They added 2 more cows. The chicken flock grew to 12. The bunkhouse was converted into a proper second room attached to the main house, the work of a long summer that involved Gerald Boone and his son, and several weeks of hammering that Abigail found objectionable. In the winter of 1888, Petra told Illy she was expecting a child. He was at the table when she told him, going over accounts, and he put the pencil down very carefully and looked at her. She was sitting across from him with her coffee cup in both hands, and her expression had that combination of things in it that significant news produces in a person who takes their life seriously. A combination of enormity and practicality, and something underneath both of those that was pure feeling with no protective layer over it. He got up from his chair and went around the table and took her in his arms, and she let herself be held, which was not always something Petra Farrow Crane did easily, and she put her face against his shoulder and was very still for a moment. "Are you frightened?" he said. "A little," she said. "Are you?" Significantly, he said. She laughed, the quick surprised laugh that still caught him sometimes. "Good," she said. "I would be concerned if you weren't." They had a son in September of 1889. Born at the farm with a midwife from Las Cruces who came out the day before and stayed through the night and part of the next day, when the child arrived in the manner that children arrive, which is to say with considerable drama, and then an abrupt and total silence filled immediately with sound. Ellie named him Thomas. He had not discussed this with Petra beforehand. He had thought about it for most of the pregnancy and arrived at it as the most honest thing he could offer to the history of the place and the person who had built it before him. And when he said it to her, quietly, in the hour after the birth, she looked at him for a long time with an expression that was the fullest thing he had ever seen on another person's face. "Thomas James Crane," she said. "If you want James," he said. "I want James," she said. Thomas James Crane came into the world in September 1889, and he was, from the beginning, a loud and determined and thoroughly unreasonable human being who demanded everything and was given everything, and seemed to understand that he had arrived in a place that had been built specifically to hold him, though he would not understand that story in full until he was old enough to ask for it and old enough to hear it properly. The years that followed were the years that good lives are made of, meaning that they were full of things, harvests and repairs and arguments about accounts and a drought in 1891, that they came through harder than they wanted to but came through, and the birth of a daughter in 1893, whom they named Clara after Petra's mother and who arrived in June and was smaller than Thomas had been and no less unreasonable. Clara was 3 years old when she discovered the elm tree in the corner of the property and developed a fierce attachment to it that her parents understood and encouraged. They told her, when she was old enough, that her father Thomas had been buried there, and Clara accepted this information in the way that children accept the histories of places they have grown up in, with the easy seriousness of someone for whom it is simply part of the landscape of their world. Ellie told Petra one evening, when the children were in bed and they were on the porch together in the summer dark, that he had never expected to have this, any of it. He said it simply, and without the kind of self-deprecation that would have turned it into a plea for reassurance. He said it as a true thing. She had looked at him and said, "I know. I think that's part of why you do it so well." "Do what well?" he said. "This," she said, and made a small gesture that encompassed the yard and the house and the dark and the presence of 2 sleeping children inside, everything that constituted the shape of their life. "You do not take it for granted, not any of it." "No," he said. "I don't." "Neither do I," she said. They sat there together in the summer dark, with the sound of the crickets and the distant coyotes and the soft occasional movement of the horses in the barn, and the land around them that had been a place of watching from outside and was now a place of belonging from within. And the night held them the way nights hold people who have come through a great deal together and arrived somewhere they want to be. Gerald Boone came to visit twice a year and always stayed for dinner, and always left having eaten more than he intended. He had known Petra since she was a new widow, and he had seen the whole of the thing change, and he said once, in the uncomplicated way of a man who says what he observes, that he had never seen a woman work harder for something she deserved, or a man more surprised to have received what he had earned. Ellie wrote to Henry Gable in El Paso every Christmas for 10 years, not from obligation but from the genuine sense that Gable had been instrumental in the shape of his life. And every year, Gable wrote back with the news of his own business, and the observation that Ellie Crane was the best possible argument for the existence of the process that had resolved his warrants. The farm grew. By 1895, they had 40 acres under cultivation, and a small herd of cattle alongside the dairy operation. And Ellie had developed a reputation in the county as someone who could diagnose a problem with a fence or a water system with unusual speed, and had been asked twice to consult for neighboring operations, which he had done and had been paid for, and which gave him a certain standing that he found more surprising than anyone around him seemed to. Petra's sister from Columbus came to visit in 1894 and stayed a month, and spent the entire time in a state of mild amazement at what her sister had built in the desert, which was entirely fair. She went home and wrote a letter that Petra read aloud to Ellie one evening, a letter that said, among other things, that she had never imagined that the life Petra had chosen would look like this, and that she was ashamed it had taken her so long to come and see it. Thomas grew into a boy who was quiet and careful and good with the horses in a way that was recognizable, and who had his father's capacity for patient attention and his mother's directness in a combination that suggested he was going to be a specific kind of person, the kind who sees things clearly and waits for the right moment and acts without hesitation when it comes. Clara grew into a girl who was none of those things and entirely her own thing instead, which was loud and inventive and deeply interested in the mechanics of how things worked, including the water system, which she redesigned at the age of 9 using a series of improvements that Ellie looked at for several minutes before acknowledging that they were better than what he had built. In 1897, Petra turned 41 and Ellie turned 44, and they were people in the middle of their lives with the specific gravity of that, the weight of everything they had accumulated and the knowledge of what it had cost to accumulate it. They were not young. They had never been young together in the easy, uncomplicated way of people who meet at the beginning of things. They had met in the middle of damage and survival and had built on that ground, and what they had built was solid, because solid was what the ground required. On a November evening in 1897, Ellie was walking the perimeter of the property in the late afternoon light, the way he still did most evenings, the habit from 3 years of nighttime watching having never fully left him. He walked the fence line and checked the water and looked at the land in the way a person looks at something they have tended for a long time and know in the way you know your own body. Petra came out to walk with him, which she did sometimes. They walked the north fence in the cooling afternoon, and then across the east pasture, and then toward the elm tree in the corner that had been there when Thomas Farrow planted it, before Lee Crane had ever seen this place. They stood by the tree for a while. The grave beneath it was marked with a stone that Ellie had helped Petra set properly in his first year on the farm, something she had managed only with a temporary marker before, and it was weathered now and permanent. "I think about the beginning of things sometimes," Petra said. "The beginning of which things?" he said. "All of it," she said. "You standing in the dark outside the barn, me not knowing all those nights." She paused. "I used to feel strange about it, unsettled, like there was something I should have felt more strongly about. You still feel that?" He said, "No," she said. She looked at the elm tree with its November bare branches. "Because I think about who you were then and who you are now, and they're the same person. You were already the person you are now. You were just standing on the wrong side of the dark." He looked at her. The afternoon light was low and golden, and it caught her hair where she had not quite got it all pinned back, and a few strands moved in the light wind that was coming up from the south. "I was always going to come to your door eventually," he said. "I know," she said. "I just had to let you get there on your own." He reached out and took her hand, the way they had been taking each other's hands for 12 years now, with the ease of something so practiced it was almost unconscious. She laced her fingers through his. "Thank you," he said. It was something he said to her sometimes and never explained further, because he trusted her to understand what it meant, which was not one specific thing but everything. "Thank you for opening the door when you did not have to. Thank you for the questions at the kitchen table, and the coffee on the step, and the bunk converted to a room, and the Sunday dress, and the surgery of honest conversation. Thank you for Thomas James and Clara. Thank you for the shelf above the fireplace, and both our names on the deed, and 12 years of being the fixed point that I needed the whole of my life, without knowing what it was." She pressed his hand and looked at him with the eyes that were still the color of river water in shade, still as direct as they had been across a rifle barrel in the frost-bitten dark. "Thank you," she said back, because she too was not going to explain further. She trusted him to understand what it meant. They walked back to the farmhouse in the last of the afternoon light, and the children's voices came through the open window. Thomas and Clara, in some argument about the mechanics of the water trough that had the specific quality of two people who were both right about different parts of the same problem. The lamp was already burning in the kitchen. The horses moved in the barn. Abigail's successor, a cow called Margaret, who was Abigail's granddaughter and had the same philosophical disposition, stood in the evening pasture in the comfortable way of animals who are well kept. The lantern light spilled from the farmhouse window in a long golden rectangle across the dark yard, and there was no shadow beside the barn. There was only the house full of living people, and the land that held them, and the night settling around them with all its enormous and familiar silence, which was not empty anymore. It had not been empty for a long time.